Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is a Tech for Good event sponsored by Entrada, and we're so glad to have this conversation about cross-generational workspaces. Actually, I think the original title was called TikTok for Boomers, which I mean, it describes uh, a need that I need to learn from quite a bit. But I'm so glad to have you guys here. We also have Joe Martin and Kyle Treasure here. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself, and then part of the introduction, I'd like you to introduce what's the name of your generation. So, Joe, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Joe Martin. I'm currently a VP of marketing at Scorpion, and just been working in tech for about 15 years. And I am a old aging millennial. So I'm 40 next year, and I've got three Gen Z kids. So, and I'm the youngest of six. So I spanned like a lot of different generations. Definitely a lot of Gen X in me, based on, my older brother's influences. So, excited to chat today.
As you're saying that, I'm like, millennials are 40? Like that blows my mind.
The
So
oldest
I would
ones, yep.
Okay, and I'm tail end Gen X. I'm like a young Gen X. So, okay, what about you, Kyle? Introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kyle Treasure. I currently work in PR for Ink House, which is a national PR agency. And I'm a recovering politico. I used to work in government and in politics on various campaigns. And I'm also a millennial. Millennials are, between 1981 and 1996. So I'm kind of a little bit smack dab in the middle of that. But yeah, like you said, the youngest millennial is like 26. The youngest millennial is getting kicked off their parents' insurance this year. So they're not starting their career. They're well into it these days. So happy to be here representing, millennials. So
Great. Well, it's good to have you guys both here. I'm really kind of curious about this topic because we always have this, like it's so easy to dismiss someone and their behaviors or the way they think because of, the generation that they belong to. When we talk about Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, I mean, that's really kind of the makeup of most of the workforce today. Does it really matter? Kyle, I'd love to get your take. You've worked with a lot of boomers too, being in politics. So do you think it does matter in the workplace?
I think it does to a point. I look at generations and generational differences kind of the same way as like learning your coworker's horoscope or color code or Myers-Briggs. It's like helpful for conflict resolution. It's helpful to understand why they do things a certain way or why they are thinking a certain way about a project or different things. So I think that's the most helpful way for me to think about it. And that's when it comes into play the most for me in my experience. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. Do you think about people's horoscopes? Because I've never been one, but they're like, oh, they're Sag, so that's why they behave that way.
Oh, I absolutely do. And color
Do
code.
you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, oh, well, they're Scorpio, so that's why they're a little intense in this meeting, or they're a Gen X, so that's why they just like didn't join, the conflict here. They just kept themselves out of it completely. Yeah, I think about that all the time.
That's so funny. Okay. What about you, Joe? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. I think it comes down to you manage everyone differently. You can have certain things that you blanket and like have as a company, but you need to treat people as have like one-to-one as well as one-to-many solutions out there. And so it helps to just understand where people are coming from, similar to cultural backgrounds, and then just making sure that you manage that if you're leading different groups, or have those extra niceties at your company that kind of support different groups and age included.
I'm so sorry. I realized like my husband is picking up my kid and he's like popping up into the background. So.
I love it.
So this whole thing of having a background didn't really help. Joe, you bring up a really interesting thing. I think that that's one of the challenges. I remember as a manager of people, not quite understanding the thinking of sometimes my team that would have fallen into that, Gen Z or millennials, and being like, oh no, this is how you're supposed to behave. And those things do really kind of taint the way that you can talk and work with people and manage people. And so I do think it is important to talk and discuss about these things. But, at what point is it like too much, where you're like, oh, well, the Gen Z, I don't know. I don't want to get any hate because I think they would come at me if I made fun of Gen Z. So I'll pick on my own generation, Gen X, where they're like, oh, they're not going to, they're just going to sit here and be steady and not really innovate, or just kind of, they're there for the job and they're hoping to get their pension, or whatever that is. Do you think that, you can manage around that? Or at some point, do you have to say like, hey, the culture of the business is this, or the culture of the company is this, and so everybody just needs to adapt and conform to it?
I think there's a couple of different cultures of a business. Like you have the company culture that has, core values and has like a nonprofit arm, or has like a mission, that people can kind of get behind. And they'll do like, I was at Adobe for a long time, and they would have events for like Black History Month for the entire month that people could go to, and they would have support for like days of service that people could kind of get into. So there's like a lot of ways that a company supports those different opportunities. And then there's the team culture, which I have a org and of quite a few people, and so we have like our own little team culture. Like we have and that's supported by like a Slack channel, or when you're able to get together for meetings, and it really takes on the persona of the leader. So mine is very much like I like manage sideways versus like up, managing up or down. Like I'm as much doing peer work with my team as I am like operating the team. And that's what works for me, and it works really well for my team. But it's kind of like figuring out who you are as a leader, and then creating that culture. And then from there's like the one-to-one culture. So it's like,
yeah,
I religiously hold one-on-ones with my team. Like it's one thing on my calendar that I never move, unless someone's sick or whatever. But each conversation is different. Like I have different relationships with each person. And so, a couple of people I know like a lot of structure. And so I'll make sure to have like a really clear agenda. And then other people like it to just be really casual. And so I'll just kind of be casual and let them bring up discussion topics. So I think it's those like different layers and levels that you gotta consider.
Yeah, so it's more individualized rather than like, oh, this is the Gen Z or the millennials, and this is exactly how you get managed because you're such.
It's a piece of it. I know a lot of baby boomers that act like Gen Z people, like it's sometimes age is just a number, like the adage says, but it's really just understanding how that may fit into just who they are as a person.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Kyle, you're now at an agency. So what's kind of the makeup of the agency and the clients that you work with? Is it kind of all over the place, or do you find one generation representing more than the other?
Yeah, in agency world, I would say it skews pretty young. It's a lot of Gen Zers, a lot of young millennials. But in our clients, it tends to skew much older. I would say closer. Like I work with tech companies exclusively, and it definitely skews more towards Gen X. There's some boomers in the mix. I don't really work with a lot of millennials.
Oh,
in
really?
Yeah. So
Hmm.
there's a few here or there, but for the most part, I would say it's probably around Gen X.
Yeah, was that surprising to you? Do you find that, because especially when you're coming in and pitching ideas and things like that, do you find that it aligns with, because your clients might be of a different generation?
You know, yeah, sometimes it doesn't align. Sometimes we pitch something, for instance, earlier today, Zoom was out, and we thought, hey, this is a great opportunity for one of our clients to throw a little shade at Zoom. And we pitched it, and it was kind of like, no, 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 we're not here to get messy on the internet, which is like Gen Z Gatorade is being messy on the internet. So we kind of had to take a step back and say like, oh, okay, like we're not going to do that. Got it. And kind of reorganize a little bit. But every once in a
Yeah,
while, something like that happens. Yeah.
yeah, maybe kind of matching more the company persona, right? So like maybe they don't feel comfortable doing that. Which kind of leads me into the next kind of thing I wanted to chat about. And Kyle, we'll start with you. But because technology and social media platforms have really increased how companies need to adapt, I think you and I recently had this discussion of like companies saying, are we supposed to do TikTok now? And and there's even like conflict between like email versus Slack, and I remember growing up like my dad like getting notifications from his BlackBerry all the time, which would be like our modern version of Slack, but through email. But how have you seen this play out, and how does do you recommend that they keep up with the pace?
Sure. I mean, excellent questions there. So yeah, on the PR side, I work on the social media side for our clients. So I see this play out constantly. It's like the number one question I'm always getting asked is, do we need a TikTok account? Do we need to get on Be Real? And I'm always like, okay, slow your roll. Be real. We don't need to worry about that yet. But yeah, digital trends, they're changing constantly. It's not like a weekly thing. It's not even like a daily thing. It's like an hourly thing. And so like a tweet that was okay, an hour, 2 hours ago might not be okay to send right now. For instance, just like last week, there was a reality show competition that tweeted out, they were like having their finale, and they tweeted out something about who's going to claim the crown. The crown is up for grabs. And it just happened. It was like
Yeah,
an hour after Queen Elizabeth II passed away. So
right.
that was like cringe, beyond cringe. So like these things are just happening so fast, and you kind of have to be a citizen of the internet, pretty consistently on in order to engage responsibly, especially for a
Uh-huh.
brand.
Right.
So that's kind of the lay of the land these days. You won't succeed unless you're able to keep up and adopt at like a breakneck speed, at least in the digital world, in the social.
Right. And Joe, I mean, you're VP of marketing over at Scorpion, and so you work with a lot of small businesses on putting together kind of their marketing strategies. What has been, are you trying to push the envelope with these small businesses? Is it useful to them? Or are you just like, no, let's just get a website up, like at this point, like, maybe you could do some text messaging or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, as a company, I mean, I for my individual role, I'm worried more about Scorpion kind of getting those new customers on the corporate level. But as a company who we help, it's still very much like focus on the very basics of digital marketing. Having a website, which is still very valuable, making sure you show up when people Google your business, having local service ads show up, And social media is really most about community, and it's all about volume. So it's like you can get 50 million views on TikTok and make $0. Like ultimately, brands, companies, maybe outside of like a blogger or a like teenager who's uber stoked about being TikTok famous, there's still like you got to find a way to make money off of it, right? So when I was leading social at Adobe, we just had like a tiered approach. So it was like wherever we had the lowest cost per acquisition and we had the highest gross revenue, that's where we allocated the majority of our marketing dollars. And that right when I left was LinkedIn. But obviously we had a strong presence for branding on Instagram and Twitter and all the other places because Adobe's such a big company. But as far as like money allocation, it was all going to LinkedIn because that's where we actually made money off of it. So, bigger teams, more budget for advertising, based off of where customers were actually coming in.
Have you seen with some of the internal tools that are being used at companies, so Slack, email, text messaging and all that, have you seen resistance or discussion around, whether people like these types of tools? I mean, right now, like my organization, we don't have a Slack channel, and I am so grateful. Like, I don't miss Slack. There are clearly some benefits, but like I am enjoying the relief of not being connected that way. And as people move steadily more online, and Kyle, you've got your remote, that has become the primary tool. But have you seen that different generations won't adapt, or maybe use it a little too much, or maybe a little bit, maybe the decorum on those channels don't work really well for the rest of the company?
I think it's still very much like tools are very much hybrid as well. So regardless of generation, you'll have some who pick it up more than others. So I think it's like a lot based on where they are in their life too. There's a lot of people who are my age and don't necessarily aren't married or have 3, kids to take care of at home. And so maybe they're like uber active on the Slack cats channel or whatever, because they like that's important to them and like that's a part of their life. Versus, I'm kind of like using Slack for work and maybe like informal team connections, since a lot of my team is not based in Utah. But yeah, I think certainly like with any tool, they can be overused, and you just got to kind of find that mix, because there's a lot of people here at Scorpion that prefer email.
Okay.
So I'll use email with them, and I'll use Slack as kind of like a bump type tool of like, hey, check out that email. Or like, email is very much longer form stuff versus like an uber long Slack that's maybe harder to find later on.
Right. What have you seen, Kyle, at your organization and your group?
Yeah, I definitely see, I'm actually new to Slack. My current job is the first time I've ever had to use it.
Oh, okay.
So I felt like the boomer coming in at this job and trying to figure out what this communication platform was. But I've had several clients who insist on phone calls. They only do business via phone call. So I've had to, pick up the phone and adapt to that, which I never really thought that I would have to do in the world. But yeah, so I've seen a little bit of everything. At least internally in our company, I feel like Slack is pretty much uniformly accepted, and that's just what people use. So
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
speaking of phone calls, like I called someone recently and she was like, "What are you doing?" She thought something was wrong. So, Joe, sorry I cut you off.
no, you're good. Yeah, it's funny that like we kind of create these like blanket statements, and I like all of us do this is natural behavior, but like yeah, you could still have the majority of the company using Slack or like the tech world even, but there's still people that prefer email, right? Or there's still
Yeah,
people that, so it's like it's funny, like it's still like is very much like a one-to-one basis almost. I mean, even on my team, like I I I know that there's some people that I just need to send a text message to, or I need to Slack
yeah,
them or send them an email, or when I've managed developers, they hate meetings, right? So like I'll
yeah.
create like cloud app videos or find out other ways to communicate with them. So it still kind of becomes like this one-to-one, almost like, we talk in marketing a lot about personalized experiences. So it's like
Right.
creating those personalized communications based on whoever you're working with.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. I do think people definitely have their preferences. So just thinking about like the tech industry itself, it has a reputation for being ageist, right? So we have glorified the college dropout, young founder who's never really had a job, um, can raise a crap ton of money, run a large company and manage people. And so at a certain point, when does that when does that I guess that reputation for young founders, when does that start to decline, at what age? People, I've heard people say this, that they feel like, oh, at a certain age it's hard for them to go get out a job. I've certainly seen like the boomer try and like dress younger, to try and fit in with their colleagues. But has that been your experience? Do you see ageism happening? Is it something that you personally have, or something that you've seen on teams or even experienced? Kyle, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like I've maybe seen it a little bit here and there. I mean, there's that joke that's been around forever that's like it's always the oldest, highest paid person at the company who like can't rotate a PDF and has to like send it to the Gen Z and be like, how do I rotate this PDF? And it's like the easiest thing in the world. Like people have said that forever. But like I think ageism, in my experience anyway, has played out more in, like almost like office politics, almost like little conversations around leadership opportunities.
Hmm.
I think younger people sometimes feel stuck at their organizations in a certain level and are unable to move up
Yeah.
because older people are, holding on to those leadership positions. And so younger people are unable to move into those.
Mm.
One time I had a coworker who said, President Nelson is 96 years old and he's still, super active. So I'm only 80. I can keep going, as in this leadership position. So maybe that's just a Utah thing, but I have noticed that that sometimes that causes a little bit of conflict, that there's a little bit of
Hmm.
ageism there amongst the younger generation when they're unable to move up.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. That's interesting to hear that perspective. Not able to move up. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think of a couple of things. Like there have been like quite a few other like pretty well-known companies. Like I think Benioff was like mid-30s when he founded Salesforce.
Hmm.
The founders of AOL were in their 40s. So there's certainly been like like Ariana Huffington, was much older when
Hmm.
she kind of started everything. So there's definitely like some of those. Obviously the bulk is, the 20 somethings that are willing to sleep on a cot in a crappy, office space. And you just aren't willing to do that when you're much older in your life.
Yeah.
for back problems, right? But like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sleeping on a cot anytime soon.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is it's celebrated at the like founder level, like you said, but like all the like tiers below that or like the middle is still very heavily focused on those like college feeders. Like
Mhm.
I'll always refer back to this time at Adobe when I walked over to a colleague's desk and he was hiring for this internship and he had a stack of like 100 resumes and he's like I have no idea what to do. Like I've met 40 of these people, they're awesome, they're all coming from Kellogg and Cal and Stanford and Harvard, like amazing schools. He's like, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know. I'll just like flip a coin and like pick. Like, there's still a ton of like volume coming in to like big companies, especially of people that have kind of that traditional path, and then they escalate. It is harder for sure though at those big companies, like especially the Adobes, the Apples, the Googles, like they definitely favor tenure in
Mm.
a role. And there's a reason for that. Like they're not going to throw in a new Harvard grad into managing an org of 50 people at a complex organization like Google. They want to, have someone who's worked at a comparable company
Mhm.
or, worked in a matrix system and tried to figure things out. So I think there's still like those barriers that are just natural, that just, should be that way. They come with experience. So there's always going to be people that can found a company, great, have 0 employees and kind of like learn along the way. But then for those like established companies, like you got to get some seasoning or you're gonna drown if you're trying to manage an org of 200 people and you have a $10 million budget
Yeah.
each quarter
Yep.
and you just graduated from college, like you're not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a comment in here about the conflation of youth and innovation, and combating that bias against age and experience. And I think that one of the things that I started in my career, and for a long time was the youngest, and so I always tried to like fit in. I felt a little awkward, and I was always like working with much older people, and so I would dress more older, and things like that to try and like kind of signal like, oh, I'm competent and I've got experience. And then as I, aged and, I was at an early employer at Instructure, which was started by 2 BYU students who hadn't even graduated yet. And so very much like I was the seasoned one, and there was value in that because I could say, oh, we've done it this way, or not kind of avoiding some mistakes that you might make when you don't have that experience. And I know that that was super valuable to the organization, that they wouldn't have had they just had everybody out of college. And I think, yes, we associate youth with innovation, but that innovation can also come later after you've had some experience and said, these are some real problems that I experienced in my business, and this is a tool that would make it really valuable.
Yeah, and there's a calm that comes from it, like when you've
Yeah.
experienced uh you know crappy quarters of growth or good quarters
Yeah.
of growth, and you've
Yeah.
experienced having to let people go, and you've experienced having to hire 20 people in a quarter. Like
Yeah.
there's just things that you experience, so you're like, okay, that was awful the first time, but the next time around it's gonna be much easier.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So Kyle, you have a background working in politics. And I remember listening to your podcast once, Inside the Hive, where you said that, these offices of these like senators and congressmen are run by interns. So, tell me a little bit about that and kind of the differences that you've seen from politics and tech, with the different ages.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of differences. I think, yeah, you pointed out one of the main ones is that, you walk around the US Capitol, the office buildings around it, it is all 20-year-olds. It's like I was there and I was like 28, 29, and I felt like I was so old. Like I was over the hill. I was ready to be put into pasture with all of these people. So yeah, so that's a big difference. And that surprised me that in tech, I've worked with a lot more seasoned, older people who kind of know what they're doing a lot more than the people who are, more or less running, the intricacies of our country. So, so that was interesting. Also, I think part of the reason why that's the case is just because in politics, salaries are so low and they rarely do you get offered benefits. It's not the kind of situation where, if you have a family, if you don't want to sleep on a cot in an office, if you're, if you don't want to be on your parents' insurance or something like that, you probably can't swing it. You can't swing a lot of those jobs in politics, in government. So, and government salaries are public domain. So sometimes I've looked them up and my jaw drops because I don't know how people are even making it work. But that's why I do think that it kind of skews younger in politics. But in tech, it's kind of a different story. In my experience, people are a little bit older. They're more like millennials. But the pace is so much faster than in government.
Yeah.
So
that's not surprising.
Right? Not at all. Nobody's going to be surprised by that statement. But like burnout in tech, I've seen is much more common than burnout in government. The burnout in government just comes from being jaded by the system. Or, seeing things like that, or your job when you work in government is a little bit more maybe intense in some ways, where it's like, I'm about to send this tweet. Will this tweet save democracy? Or, what I mean? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of pressure that kind of gets put on everything that you do in politics. So that can lead to its own kind of burnout. But in tech, I feel like on one hand, it's nice that you're kind of just selling a product. You're just selling a service or a product. You're just kind of, there's not like that existential, attachment to it. But the pace is so much faster. The demand is so much higher that I've seen way more burnout on the tech side than the government side in the workforce. So.
Question for you though, do most of these politicians run their own Twitter accounts?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay.
No. And a younger staffer would not let their boss, anywhere near. I bet most of them don't even know what the password is.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. One exception might be Chuck Grassley. That might actually be coming from him, though I kind of have my doubts. I mean, the Orrin Hatch tweets from a few years ago.
Yeah.
100% his staff. Those were not from him. So
yeah.
That's a peek behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I saw a local legislator write a tweet and then he signed from Steve or something like that. And I just kind of laughed. I was like, you don't need to say sincerely or, everybody knows it came from you, but it was just that guy wrote his own tweet.
My mom signs her text. So her text message.
I love it. Well, my favorite is when my mom figured out how to do memes. And she just started or sending gifts, like and it would be like 20 at a time, and none of them like made sense. I think they were all funny individually, but not within context of anything we were talking about. So it was kind of fun for me to
Awesome.
watch my mother do that. Yeah. Um, so Joe, as you've grown in your career, you've grown up in tech, and you've certainly been at large companies and small companies and all of that. What is like with your seasoned maturity, what kind of advice would you give your younger self?
I think it's just, a career is really long. I mean, the average career is long, right? Certainly there's some people that are able to like peace out much earlier than others, but
Mm-hmm.
it ends up being 40 years. Like that's somewhat depressing, but also like there's also a reason to work, it's gives you a reason to get up in the morning, and you get fulfillment from it. So I think I probably didn't realize that until like 10 years into my career. Whereas like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I've still got like a long time, like 30 more years of this potentially. So it's a long journey. You're never too old to start something different. But soak up, one of the I stayed at Adobe for 7 years, and part of that was to just, it's a great company, and I would honestly go back there, but I just soaked up as much as I could of like, and it was still a train wreck internally too, like every company, but seeing how processes were done and how you like could scale something if it worked, and like put money behind something if it was working. So just like learn as much as possible along the way, and realize it's a long journey. Like it's a good chunk of time to, so there's no rush to get to that, upper echelon level.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good point. I mean, you mentioned being 7 years at Adobe. I was at a company for eight plus years, 8.5 years, and that's like freaking forever these days.
Yeah.
Like I mean, and so I'm like a little jealous of people that are starting out in their careers. I'm like, they get to do, because back then switching jobs every other year would not look good on a resume, and there would be a lot of questioning about that, where I think there is more acceptance of that. But they probably get to experience a lot more things, and a lot more companies and a lot more different types of jobs. And yeah, I get a little jealous of that. And so now when I talk to I college kids and things like that, I'm like, just recognize that, like, if you go in a certain direction and you don't like it, you can always change it. You're not set in a path, where you feel like you have to stay there and finish out your career at that one company doing that one thing, um, like the boomers did. So
I Yeah, and I honestly, I truly believe, and I'm having a great time right now, but I truly believe like my early career is going to be my like favorite part of my career.
yeah,
Just when everything is new, you're just soaking up so much information. It's just was such a fun part of life. And yeah, I'll always like envy that or enjoy it, kind of thinking back
yeah,
on it.
yeah, for sure. So I know we have some questions, so I do want to kind of wrap this up pretty quickly, but Joe, older millennial, Kyle, younger or middle, is it middle millennial?
I think I'm
Me,
mid. Yeah.
yeah, Gen X. Maybe you guys have talked a lot about yourself. Um what would be some advice you would give to someone in the Gen X phase, like, in working with them? Do you have any advice for someone who is of, my generation?
Go ahead, Kyle.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I guess some advice that I would give is to just like understand or realize or see that even if millennials aren't asking for it, even if millennials, especially younger millennials, don't seem like they want it, they are in desperate need of mentorship.
Mm,
they're in desperate need of learning from more seasoned people, more seasoned employees, more seasoned leaders. There's been a lot of instability in the millennial career track with the Great Recession, with the pandemic, with all these different things. And we have to, it's time that we gain some experience from, you know, the older generation, from the people who have been in the trenches for a lot longer than us. And I think millennials are keenly aware that that they're going to be running things soon in these companies. And I don't think most millennials are ready for that. So I would hope that Gen Xers, boomers, the people in those categories are able to reach out and mentor some of the younger people. That would be some advice, because I think that would actually combine or bring the generations together, instead of it being like a, you know, a weird competition thing between them.
Right.
So that would be something I would say.
Yeah, interesting. What about you, Joe? You're the older millennial, so let's say like let's up it like higher end older Gen Xers and boomers.
So I think it's, you know, being an older millennial, my leadership has, and now peers have mostly been Gen X, right? So like I've had mentors along the way, and I think kind of taking from what they gave to me is just recognizing when there's just someone who's either hungry or willing to kind of put in the work to grow, to give them those opportunities. You know, that's what my leaders have done to me. That's really helped me. And I've never really felt like a lot of my peers now are, you know, 10 or more years older than me, but I've never really felt like I've been treated differently. So I think that's just kind of maybe some advice there, is like, eventually I'm going to be at a point in my career where I might have someone older than me or younger than me who's my boss. I don't know, possibly. So just kind of like trying to not make that affect things, or feel like, oh, well, I'm older and have more experience, so no, I should be the one that is like leading this project or whatever. And so yeah, it's kind of taking from what some of my peers along the way have taught me, is just like treating people based on just being a really good person to work with, or just really smart and good at process, or, you know, a good leader, regardless of the age they are necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, like, you know, you're all like being in a position where you might report into someone who's younger than you. And that would be a weird thing to experience. One thing I would say, like, that I like admire the millennials and the Gen Z is the and sometimes it's a joke, but you know, the demand for things, or feeling that entitlement, you know, is something that, you know, we kind of say is I don't want to say we, but I've heard that, you know, comes from, you know, the younger generation. And you know, one experience, you know, I had my oldest when back in 2006. And at that time, like, my company didn't know what to do with a woman who was pregnant, who was planning to come back to work, that they just had never experienced it. And so, you know, that kind of set the tone that, you know, I couldn't talk about my family. I couldn't, you know, I had to pretend like, you know, I had to be earlier than everybody. I had to stay later, you know, because I almost had to prove myself. And I remember one time I was on a call, and this was later when I started my own company, and it was a call with a bunch of other founders in an investment portfolio. And this guy just was like rocking his baby on a video call while doing this work, and it blew my mind, blew my mind. And I was like, you know what? He didn't ask for permission. He just did it. It wasn't a big deal, and it kind of let me know that some of the things that I would have never felt comfortable asking, he just, he took it. And so in a way, like, even though my generation didn't get to have these things, I am very appreciative that the millennials and the Gen Zers are asking for those things, because I get to benefit from it as well, and so that's been really fun for me.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And like the pandemic was obviously a huge forcing function for all of us. Satya at Microsoft said along the lines of, it was several years of digital transformation talk forced into several weeks.
Yeah.
And that, I think that has been a gender breaker, not gender, age breaker, right?
Yeah.
Like we were all kind of forced into these Zoom conference rooms, regardless of if we were comfortable with it or not. And yeah, I had a lot of kids on conference calls, and it's like, hey, like schools are closed, like, sorry, and dogs would jump in, and just kind of became like, a normal thing that bonded us all together. So it's kind of cool it like very much merged generations in a way.
Yeah, I think so. It kind of just forced us into it. One good thing from the pandemic. So we have a question here, Kyle. This is for you. You mentioned something about conflict resolution and the differences in communication styles. What can you expand a little bit more on what you meant by that? Like, what would be a good example of, a situation where you've had different generations and a conflict?
Sure, yeah. I feel like, in any business and any work environment and any group of people, there's going to be disagreements. There's going to be times where you don't see eye to eye. And I've just seen so many instances like that. And just being able to take a step back, I know it's been helpful for me anyway. When let's say I'm working with a boomer who's getting so frustrated because we're trying to, take a process digital. We're trying to take a process online that used to be, printing a paper and delivering it to their desk. This is a very specific example that has happened. Having to just sit down with that person, but being able to recognize that this is frustrating because this person has been doing it this way their entire career, and then this person who's much younger than them, is trying to flip the script, is trying to change things for no good reason,
Right.
question mark. So
yes.
So just being able to recognize that, I think brings a level of empathy to the conversation. And then you can kind of meet people where they're at. It helps me to not, railroad people, to just kind of, see from a different perspective and see them as an individual. I like what Joe said earlier about just managing individuals, that it's sure, they might be a boomer, but maybe they love technology. Maybe they don't, it's all about looking at the individual and what they what their skill set is, what their comfort level is, different things like that. So, and same with Gen Z, it goes both ways. You might not put a boomer in charge of a Twitter account, but you also wouldn't put a Gen Zer in charge of the landline phone or a floppy disk or something like that. The company Abacus or something, you wouldn't put a Gen Zer in charge of that. So it's just about, making sure that there's empathy in the conversation and maximizing the unique viewpoint and skill set that each generation brings to the table.
Yeah, and to that point, the boomer or the Gen Xer may not run the Twitter account, but they might manage the team that does. So you've got to, the older you get, you have to form an opinion. I may not know everything there is to know about TikTok, as an example. I don't. But if I hired someone to kind of run that channel, I would at least like do some research or like talk to some colleagues or like form an opinion so that, you know, you can take on that mentor role, even though they're the one on the front lines. You're the one that's like creating the strategy, creating the process, and operating it, you know, from afar.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, because there's so many times where I'm like, I could probably figure out how to do this. I just know that I'm probably not the right, because I'm not gonna follow TikTok. I only watch TikTok when friends send me one, you know, and so I'm not gonna be the one that's gonna create content for that site. But if it makes sense, then that's an appropriate channel for the company and understanding the strategy behind it. But then having someone actually run, I think that's really a great way to use kind of those different perspectives and different ages and generations.
Totally.
Well, yeah, so this is about all the time that we've got left. Joe and Kyle, it was so fun to talk to you both. I think I learned a lot about just having that individualized. It's so easy for us to put everybody in a bucket and say you belong here, but just hearing from both of you, learned a lot about having that one-to-one relationship and understanding the different perspectives. So yeah, thanks so much for your time, and we'll make sure to post this recording. And thanks to Entrada for sponsoring.
Thank you, Sunny.
Okay, see you guys. Bye.